Welcome back to another live stream. I actually just straight off the bat to keep things professional had a error message even before I'd really started. So if anyone can just let me know that they're seeing this. Um, hey JE and Hobo already in the chat. Hope you're both doing well. Um, yeah, I think we should be good. Um, so Okay, nice one. Cheers, GE. Yeah, I don't know. It's like every time I go live, some like thing just goes a bit weird. Anyway, so I had some free time today, and I wanted to do the second part of the Antinatalist MD reactions. So for anyone that hasn't seen the first one, I will do a tiny bit of background. So basically, there is a YouTube channel run by a guy who is a doctor, a healthcare professional, and an antinatalist. And his channel is called Antinatalist MD. And he has done, I think technically there's 21 videos, but a series of 20 videos where he talks about a variety of topics, but from the perspective of someone who's a healthcare professional and an antinatalist. So there's 20 episodes, but there's an additional video which is I haven't actually watched it, but by the sounds of the title, it's him having a conversation with someone who's not an antinatalist. So I've already done a stream, which was part one episode, which we went through episodes 1 to 10, and I wanted to get in a live stream doing 11 to 20. So that is this live stream. So Jay's in the chat saying that they love the streams. Well, thank you. I actually quite enjoy doing them because what I actually do now, well, not with this specific one because this one's themed, it's, Antinatalist MD, but with the reaction streams, now what I do is if I come across a video that I think would be interesting to watch and I don't think I need to see it immediately, I'll add it to the reacting playlist so that, next time I do a stream, then, we can just like watch it together. So I quite like doing that now. So anyway, let's get straight into it. If there are 7 people watching at the moment, but only 2 have jumped in the chat. So if you're watching and haven't said anything in the chat, say hello so we can see who's here. But obviously, if you don't want to, that is completely up to you, and that is also perfectly fine. So let's just get cracking. Tim Schulz, I think is how maybe you say your name, is in the chat as well. Hey Tim. Cool. Yeah, let's get cracking because I actually don't think there's really much preamble we need to do for this one. So cool. So yeah. This one is episode 11. Hey JB as well. So this one is episode 11, and it's, well, you can see that, practicing medicine as an antinatalist. So let's see what he's got to say about that. Obviously, as always, let me know if there are any issues with audio. And Rune is in the chat as well. Hello from Sweden. Was it Dave was in the chat yesterday from Sweden? So Rune, you've got a fellow Swede that watches the streams. I don't know if Dave is here now, but yeah. And CDA Activism is here. First time catching one of the lives. I actually didn't realize this was one of your lives. I see your comments everywhere, so I just assumed like you'd been in one of the lives. I'm actually getting the sun pulverizing me right now, so I'm actually just going to quickly close the curtain and then we'll crack on. Fuck, I haven't done it properly. Hang on. There you go. You get a bit of behind the scenes there. Okay, cool. Right. Yeah, let's go for this.
I wanted to talk a bit about what it's like to practice medicine as an antinatalist. Not just me thinking about the theoretical philosophical questions, but the implications of day-to-day decisions and the emotions that accompany those decisions. One of my main motivations in becoming a doctor was in having a pragmatic skill set that can help reduce suffering by addressing health problems. Of course, there are innumerable ways to help reduce suffering, but medicine made sense for me personally. I only came across antinatalism later on in my career, but the motivation for this was also the reduction of suffering and harm. The longer I am in medicine, the more I realize that if I'm doing my job right, and if patients do their part in following healthy habits, I should be putting myself out of business. Although this could be taken in the financial sense, what I really mean is that ideally I should work toward helping people need me less. After all, this is what...
Yeah, it's with healthcare, it's like the key is prevention, right? Like someone like the perfect, well, not the perfect situation, because the perfect situation obviously would be that, you know, they never existed to even need healthcare, but assuming someone exists, like the perfect situation would be that they live in such a way where they never need the healthcare system. Now, obviously, like everyone at some point in their lives is going to need it. So, you know, that doesn't actually work in practice. But generally, if you have an approach to life where you try and be as self-sufficient as possible, it will help you because, I mean, like no one wants to be in and out of healthcare. Like it's not a nice part of your life in general, right? But two, like you may have access to good healthcare now, but like you don't know what the future is like. You don't know if you won't be able to get that healthcare in the future because of some situation in your life has changed, or the healthcare system just goes downhill. So if you live in such a way where you don't rely on it, obviously that's easier said than done. Some people are just born in a way where like they have a certain condition where they're just like they have to rely on it. But if you have the option to be as self-sufficient as possible and not use the healthcare system, seems like the best way to go about things. So I agree with him there. And then once someone makes contact with the healthcare system, if they're then put through a process where they acquire the skills, or maybe they are given some form of medication, where they then are put back on the right track of not having to use the healthcare system. And it also means you won't be using resources that other people who really need to use the healthcare system can depend on. Cool. Okay, nice one. And yeah, CDA is saying that they're usually at work when I go live. Yeah, sorry about that. Like I was usually doing them at the time I did them because of the hot weather, and I have had issues in the past where my equipment is overheated, and I haven't wanted to get like a fan because it would be like annoying in the background. So yeah, but now it's winter and everything's cooling down, I will actually be able to do them at different times in the day because I won't have the overheating issue. So yeah, hence, you know, it's already starting to get a bit cooler in the UK now, so hence why I'm doing this at this time.
What I want as a patient, to need as little medical care as possible due to being in good health. The medical system as a whole doesn't reward this type of thinking. It rewards revenue generation through greater healthcare use. More visits, more medications, more procedures. Obviously, I'm not against medical treatments at work to improve people's lives, and not every disease is clearly preventable, but a system that values treatment over prevention is pretty messed up, in my opinion. I try to keep all this in mind in my practice, but people are complex and their autonomy needs to be respected, so prevention is not easy to achieve, especially in a society that doesn't value it enough. To me, antinatalism is an extension of harm prevention. By not procreating, all the suffering the new person would have endured is avoided. To put it less diplomatically...
Yeah, it's interesting. With what do you call it? Antinatalism being a form of harm prevention, it seems like a distinct form of harm prevention than other forms. And like maybe maybe I'm going too far out on a limb here. Like maybe this doesn't actually make sense, but like antinatalism as when someone's alive, right, there are forms of harm prevention that they or society in general can engage in, and that's preventing forms of harm that would otherwise occur to some vulnerable being. But like antinatalism is because, and so what you're doing there is you're changing things either about the individual or the environment surrounding the individual. That means that less harm, they're going to come into contact with less harm, right? But with antinatalism, it's targeting a different thing. Instead of changing the being or the environment of the being, it's simply just not creating the being in the first place. So I don't know if that does make it in any significant way distinct from other forms of harm prevention. Yeah. And also, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, antinatalism could be seen as a form of harm reduction, but I think it is more accurate to say prevention, because at least definitely in the philanthropic sense, like you're not reducing harm by not creating someone. You're simply just not creating it in the first place. It's like at a school, if there's one kid who's thinking about bullying another kid, but they decide not to, they haven't reduced suffering. They've just not inflicted suffering, if you get what I mean. But yeah, anyway. So I don't know if there's like any sort of like hardcore ethical difference there between antinatalism and other forms of harm prevention, but it's an interesting difference anyway.
Don't make a mess. We don't have to worry about cleaning it up. Giving medical advice is a bit of a juggling act with prevention, autonomy, evidence-based practices, emotions, cultural sensitivities, trust, and so on and so forth. Then there's a bit of moral distress that I feel when a patient makes a decision I find unethical. One time I saw a patient whose parent had recently been diagnosed with Huntington's disease. Huntington's is an inherited condition that leads to movement abnormalities and psychiatric illness and eventual dementia, usually by age 40 or so. He had already had a child before he knew about this diagnosis, but now he was planning to have a second child. Despite this new information, he did not want to wait for genetic testing to make a decision. As a doctor, my job is mainly to inform and give advice. What people do with that advice is up to them.
Yeah, honestly, I've got to say he is in a difficult position, because you will be advising people on certain things that you really disagree with, which is a tricky one. It's actually similar to I know a couple of vegans who are nutritionists, and if they work independently, then fine, they can label themselves as a vegan nutritionist. But if they work for a clinic, sometimes not sometimes, like many times often, they will get clients who are not vegan, and because you're working for a clinic, you have to toe their line. So you have to advise them in ways that fit certain criteria that they can put in place. So obviously sometimes they have to make diet plans with like animal products in. And to be honest, I just like, I don't know if I'd be able to do that job, to be honest. Like it's not that it's not that if I was trained I wouldn't be able to do the job. I would just find it there would be too much friction with my values. I just sometimes just wouldn't be able to keep my mouth shut. I wouldn't be able to do a job where I have to keep my teeth gritted the whole time. And I'm sure he has to do this with, not all the time, obviously, because there are many forms of healthcare, but I'm sure he has to do this with his job. And Nadia's in the chat. Hey, Nadia.
After all, it's their life and their body. But obviously I'm not a robot, and I'm not numb to the consequences of people's decisions. So with this patient in particular, there was a mix of emotions. I thought, isn't it reckless to go on with procreation knowing that there is a very real chance of giving the child Huntington's? Maybe. But is it really any more reckless than having a child otherwise? Every time someone procreates, it's a huge gamble. So why was I more distressed with this situation? Maybe it was the fact that we were explicitly talking about it, and he still knowingly chose to procreate. This made me sad and frustrated. But of course, I didn't share my emotions with him because at the end of the day, it's not about me.
I think it is valid to feel particularly frustrated, whatever word you want to use with a case when when you're presented with a case like that, and there's two reasons that I can see, right? The first one is that if you are talking to someone who has a hereditary disease which is either very likely or 100% going to pass on to their kid, you are dealing with a situation where, and this depends on the condition obviously, so like everyone who's created has the capacity to suffer, so it's like that's the core issue. But when you're dealing with someone with a hereditary disease, there's like it's like you're not just creating a victim, you're like rubbing salt in their wound, if you get what I mean. And obviously a hereditary disease is not the only way that you can rub salt in a wound. And then the other sort of way, the second way that I think that you can be particularly frustrated with a case like this is that that part of it, that first reason, is centered on the one being created, but the second reason is centered on the people creating them. And it's that most people will go along and create someone and not really have any contact with the ethical consequences when they're thinking about it. But someone who has been informed of a particular condition that the offspring is going to have, like they've been forced to make ethical contact with it. So it becomes even more frustrating when you can see someone who is knowingly and someone who's cognitive, how do you say that word? Cognizant, I think. Anyway, someone who's like completely aware of what they're doing to this individual, and they do it anyway. So I think there are like at least two reasons to be particularly like frustrated with cases like this.
Rather about him and the potential future child. I can only imagine what he has to deal with in knowing this information. I don't know anything about his...
Mike's in the chat, bigging up the Bible. What a legend, obviously. And yeah, everyone remember to repent.
Family dynamics or his life goals or his fears. So although his decision is likely not ethically right, and it is tempting to be quick to condemn it, there's also a lot that I don't know. This is just one example. A more common related issue is when I give advice regarding contraception in general. As part of standard primary care, contraception is an important topic that should be addressed with everyone to whom it is applicable. If someone is sexually active and pregnancy is possible, I simply ask if contraception is used consistently and reliably. For those who want contraception and are not yet using it, I'm happy to talk about the options. For those who are not interested, I move on to the next topic. But at least I've done my job in reminding them of the obvious fact that intercourse without contraception could lead to pregnancy, and that contraception is an option. All in all, my antinatalist beliefs probably have more of an impact in how I interpret and emotionally handle things than it does on my actual medical practice, other than to say that I place a great deal of importance on preventive healthcare and habits. I'd be curious to hear people's experiences with how you handle being an antinatalist working in healthcare. or how you deal with healthcare providers as an antinatalist, if it plays a part at all. Thanks for listening.
Let's see the comments and see if anyone has actually responded to what he's saying. There are not more people. Yeah. There's someone here studying medicine. Speciality in euthanasia. Yeah, I can't really see anyone who's actually working in medicine like responding to him. Cool. So the next one is called
For most people,
the burden of antinatalism. So my guesses are going to be that the burden that he's talking about is the burden of being aware of all of the sort of wrongs and suffering and injustices in the world and how it weighs on you mentally, I would assume.
many of the antinatalist conclusions seem brutal. They are emotionally heavy, dark, and difficult to process. For example, take the following common conclusions of the philosophy. Creating sentient beings causes suffering where none was there before. Having children is therefore immoral, so everyone who has had children has done a great wrong, whether they realize it or not. Parents are ultimately responsible for the death of their offspring, since, had the children not been brought into existence, they would not have had to endure their eventual inevitable death. If everyone abstained from committing the immorality of procreation, humans would go extinct. Even though ethical antinatalism is based on solid principles like prevention of suffering and respect for autonomy and consent, the truth is, if you're not ready to handle the logical conclusions of antinatalism, they can be emotionally destabilizing. If you take antinatalism seriously, it could put into question your whole worldview.
Yeah, actually in the stream yesterday of the reacting videos, there was one video that we watched where it was by the graphene rule, and I think it was called The Problem of Antinatalism or something like that, or Problem with I can't remember. But in that he talks about this trade-off that some people have to make between recognizing the ethical weight of the antinatalist argument and embracing that, or your mental well-being, like your life experience. Now, luckily for many people, they don't have to make that trade-off because they can intellectually hold a position in their head, but not have it like really have any. There's no kickback from that in their emotional lives. But for some people, they find it very hard to separate those two things out. And like honestly, I really feel for those people. And this doesn't just go for this issue. There's many ethical issues where this will be the case, where people are so emotionally invested and impacted by an issue, which is completely understandable. Hey, Futile's in the chat as well, which is completely understandable, and something that you know the people who don't have that issue should empathize with, because imagine becoming aware of a great injustice in the world, or the fact that there are so many individuals suffering in a way that you did not understand before, and it's a very significant way, and you can't get your mind off it. You know, there are people like that. For example, I was listening to a podcast the other day by George Martin, Carnism Debunked, with the lady, I forget her name now, but the lady who runs Bite Size Vegan. And she was saying that she's autistic, and I'm pretty sure she was saying this is relating to her autism, that she was saying that as a result of her autism, she can't switch off the thing in her head that makes her essentially experience secondhand suffering from all the suffering that's going on around her. So she's specifically, thinking about the things that happen to animals in animal agriculture and clothing industry and animal experiments and stuff. And she was just saying, like, some people can just hold that intellectual belief, that rejection of animal exploitation, and they can hold that as an intellectual thing, but not have it emotionally drain them every day. And she was saying that as a result of her autism, she just can't do that. Like her like, however you would call it, like, her empathy is just constantly pumping. Honestly, like, I feel for people like that, because it must be a very difficult way to live. I mean, it can have its advantages in terms of those people can be the most dedicated people because they have this constant, thing pounding away at them in their head. But it also just must be really difficult to live like that. Anyway, Hobo's also back in the chat. Cool. Okay, let's listen to the rest of this one.
Depending on what it was founded on to begin with. I've had very emotional conversations on antinatalism, and I wanted to make space for the toll this topic can take on people, both antinatalists and non-antinatalists. As antinatalists, not only do we have to deal with the conclusions I just mentioned, but we also have to deal with the fact that most people in the world do not agree with us. To be clear, none of this makes the philosophy any less true, but it does mean that we carry a sort of burden. I think of this burden a bit like I think about facing my own mortality. It's there, it's undeniable, but with time you get used to it. And eventually it may even become an odd source of comfort.
So I don't know specifically what he means there by an odd source of comfort, but what I could get from that is that one way that it can be an odd source of comfort is that it a realization, an ethical realization like antinatalism or veganism or some other one, it can engage you in a subject that you care about, which you haven't before. So you become more active as a person in terms of you actually care about things, and you become more intentional with your actions, and you become more ethically aware on other issues as well. But it can also engage you with a community, like a new community. You can form strong friendships and bonds with other people, new people that you wouldn't have before, because you have this shared understanding of the world. Now, not to liken it in because, well, I guess I am likening it, but I think there's a similar thing with religion. So, in the past, when the world, maybe it's less significant now, because we have the internet, but with religion in the past, it served as a bonding mechanism for people, right? It still serves as a bonding mechanism for now, but the specific example that I'm going to give is still relevant today, but it's not as relevant. So in the past, it would take many months, even years, to travel great distances, whereas now, you can travel to the other side of the world in a day. But in the past, it was a great journey, right? But religion, if you take the example of Christianity, spread across the world, someone could leave one part of the world, go to a completely another part of the world, whole different culture, all this sort of stuff, like completely foreign and alien to you. But you meet someone in a market or a town square or whatever, and they are also Christian. You instantly know certain things about that person and have a shared thing, an experience that you can, an understanding of the world that you can use to relate with each other. And the same thing is with antinatalism or veganism now. Like if you, for example, I don't know, let's say you go to, let's say you're, I don't know, what is a good example? I mean, this is like a very, like, I don't actually know if this would actually happen to people, but just to illustrate an example, you go on holiday somewhere and, you in a bar or something, you're talking to a few people, and you find out that one of them is vegan or is antinatalist, you would instantly be able to command more rapport with that person and have more of a connection with that person, and probably be much more interested in spending time and getting to know that person than the other people, because you have this sort of more unique connection with them, right? So I can understand. So if that is one of the things he means by like an odd source of comfort, then I can agree with that.
Non-antinatalists may be battling with the burden of facing mortality, and antinatalism simply reminds them of this. I once heard someone say, when arguing against antinatalism, I have no interest in believing in something so horrible when I can believe in something wonderful. And later saying, I'll take suffering if it means humans have a future. I understand where they're coming from. It's hard to come to terms with the fact that humans will not be around forever. And if your source of hope is in humans continuing to exist indefinitely, it's hard to step back and think about the cost entailed in delaying the unavoidable extinction of humanity, the suffering of billions of people that ultimately will not prevent the inevitable. Because it is in the presumably far future, it seems too abstract. But the truth is, it will be just as real as the suffering of currently existing people if we decide to contribute to this cycle. This person's response made me think about whether the potential gloominess that antinatalism can cause is an effective argument against it. After all, some people might not be able to handle the existential crisis the philosophy might cause.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's about to say what he's about to say, but in terms of my reaction to that question, I don't think it would say anything against like the philosophy or the arguments or like the truth of it. But it can definitely be a consideration in terms of how people are going to be impacted by coming to this understanding. So if we understand that many people are, you know, when it comes to their experience of the world, it coming to this realization can cause them to become more sensitive or have more sort of mental anguish. It may not be a significant amount more, but it just maybe be some. If we have that understanding, then those in the community that have the initiative can put things together, put frameworks together that can support those people. So, you know, one example which I've been talking about recently is meetups. Being able to physically meet or, you know, virtually meet with people who, you know, share a similar outlook with you on the world. That is a comforting thing for people, and it can help people if they're going through a lot mentally. So, yeah, recognizing issues like that, I think, are good. One, because you come to a closer understanding of the truth, but also it means that you understand an issue and you can implement a solution or like alleviate it in some way.
If the thought of anti-nihilism increases suffering for that person sufficiently, maybe this is a reason not to expose this person to the philosophy. However, this only makes sense if the person does not procreate. In other words, one can believe the anti-nihilist position to be wrong in order to feel better about life, but ethically it only is acceptable if in the end one doesn't in turn cause more suffering by reproducing. Despite the potential gloominess of the philosophy, anti-nihilists can still enjoy the pleasant things in life. After all, the goal of minimizing suffering includes minimizing our own suffering. And I do think it's possible to both hold anti-nihilism to be an ethical way of making decisions, while at the same time enjoy things even if they are immersed in a pro-nihilist world. Nihilism doesn't seem pragmatically useful either. Even if one believes in a globally meaningless universe, there is still meaning locally because joy matters to the individual, just like suffering matters to the individual.
yeah, it's like obviously it would have been better if, you know, you were never here, but like now you are. Make the best of it you can, you know. Like, no, I've 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 literally never heard, and I'm not, obviously he's not saying this, but I'm just saying in general. Like, I've never heard an antinatalist say that we should actively like just wallow in badness. You know, like we should obviously all try and have as good a lives as possible.
For the already existing person, a few moments of joy are still of value. Another thing to realize when faced with the gloominess of a philosophy is that its realism has a lot of merit. Antinatalists know the end is inevitable, whether talking about our personal death or the eventual extinction of humans. So instead of pretending death and suffering don't exist or can't be prevented in the future, we decide to actually take the ethical route and not perpetuate suffering to future generations. That is an amazing accomplishment to be proud of, even if we just do it at a personal level. And just maybe, knowing this can bring comfort, even if everything else around us goes badly. Thanks for listening.
So that was episode 12. Oh, nice. So episode 13 will be an interesting one. So, sorry, I opened that in a new window rather than a new tab. Fuck. Everything's going wrong. Yeah, so 13 will be an interesting one. So it's about Aniara. Well, I might be saying that wrong. Aniara. Which, as you can see here, is a film. So I'm pretty sure he will explain what the film is. But yeah, basically, Aniara is a film that someone could draw some antinatalist themes from, but it's also just a very interesting film. It immerses you in this situation that, well, let's just listen to what he says, because I actually don't want to say too much. If he doesn't say it, then I will add the bit. I'll try to remember to add the bit that I was just about to say on the end if he doesn't say it. But if you enjoy this video, there's also Voidcast, which is a vegan antinatalist podcast run by two guys, a guy in London and a guy in Germany. I forget which city now. And they did an episode on Aniara as well. So if you enjoy the sound of this film, go watch it, and then listen to their breakdown as well, which I'll try to remember to link in the description.
Every once in a while you come across a movie that causes you to ponder for a long time after watching it. I watched the movie Aniara recently, which is based on a famous Swedish poem of the same name, and it's worth unpacking some of the themes it brings up, such as sense of purpose, existential crisis, procreation in a hopeless world, and the limits of optimism, to name a few. I will be talking about the whole movie, and I would give a spoiler alert, but really, even after hearing the spoilers, the movie is still worth watching. The basic plot goes like this. Earth's environment is too chaotic and dangerous for humans to continue living in it, so people are routinely transported to a Mars colony to continue life there. Aniara is the name of a massive spaceship that ferries a couple thousand people at a time. The trip is supposed to take 3 weeks, but the pilots are suddenly forced to change course and dump fuel, avoiding colliding with space debris on the way to Mars. This turns out to mean the ship is unable to get back on course, and the ship drifts out into deep space without a clear way to get back. Aniara is basically a self-sustaining small city, and they figure out a way to continue making food, apparently having enough energy to power all the ship's inner workings. The main character, MR, operates an artificial intelligence called Mima on the ship, that reads people's memories and allows them to re-experience pleasant memories of the Earth as it used to be, in a sort of very realistic virtual reality. As time goes on, more and more people are interested in this experience as a form of escapism from their plight. But eventually, Mima is overwhelmed with people's despair and emotional burdens and self-destructs. It's quite an interesting twist to have AI essentially kill itself due to humanity's mental burdens, and it might be a commentary on how simulation technology, and perhaps technology in general, has its limits in saving humanity from itself. Throughout the journey, the captain attempts to publicly keep a stoic face about the situation and outright lies about the ship's chances to get back, giving passengers false hope. This character seems to represent an authority figure that will do whatever it takes to maintain order and avoid chaos from the reality of hopelessness. It seems that telling people there is still hope is also his own way to avoid thinking about the inevitable, even though intellectually he knows the truth. As the years go by, MR forms a romantic relationship with one of the pilots named Isabel. They somehow find themselves being part of a ritual in a cult that worships and prays to the now dead Mima. As a result of her actions at one of these gatherings, Isabel becomes pregnant. Earlier in the movie, Isabel's character is described as fatalistic, and facing the potential of giving birth to a child under these conditions doesn't seem to help. There is one scene where she is seen deeply regretting being pregnant, saying, "There are no possibilities here. I'll give birth to a prisoner. I'll deliver someone to eternal night." Although not explicitly antinatalistic, the movie at least encourages one to think of the ethics of bringing more humans into this situation.
I bet you so that misses so many people who watch this movie by. I think I bet so many people just procreation is just so normalized, obviously, that most people wouldn't even think they would see what the character is saying, but they would in no way relate that to their own lives and make them question their own actions. I would bet.
Throughout much of the movie, MR represents the tenacious optimist. She is often in a good mood and seems to bounce back even after the many episodes of bad news. Although she does suffer from occasional panic attacks, which she deals with in private. After Isabel's dark reflections on her bringing a child, MR quickly responds saying, "I promise, it's going to be fine." And for a while, it seems things are okay. They raise the child together, and Isabel hides her persistent fatalism. But eventually, Isabel tragically kills herself and the child, and MR doesn't seem to ever recover from this. The movie seems to draw a line for the limits of optimism and people's different psychological breaking points. Another interesting character was the ship's astronomer. Due to her background knowledge, she is one of the few people who knows from the beginning there is no realistic way for the ship to get back, despite whatever the captain says. In an attempt to drown out her realizations, she drinks alcohol heavily most of the day. At one point, she does discover a mysterious object is heading for the ship. At first, it is thought this could be a rescue fuel rod, but eventually it turns out not to be. Again, she is the first to arrive at this correct conclusion, and she turns back to alcohol. As she confronts the captain about his denial and hypocrisy surrounding the false hope he gives passengers, the captain gets fed up with her and shoots her dead. With impunity, I may add, since no one really questions his authority. The astronomer seems to represent the realist who knows too much and can't keep quiet, and who eventually collides with an authority figure who is ever more desperate to maintain order and some semblance of hope. The last survivors are seen chanting in a dark room 24 years into the journey. Their faces cachectic almost zombie-like, essentially awaiting death. In a strangely haunting way, the last frame of the movie shows the ship 5.9 million years afterwards, traversing by an Earth-like planet in the Lyra constellation. The music is pretty impactful, leaving you thinking, sitting still.
Just checking how long there is left, because I'm just thinking I don't know if he's going to make the point. So he may make the point, but let me just make it now, because it is getting towards the end, and now he's talking about music, so I'm not sure he will. So one, there are many interesting things that this movie, will make someone who is, interested in think about this stuff. There are many things, but there are two key things that either came to my mind or I've been made aware of. So the first point is, it obviously it makes you it brings to the forefront the question of whether it's ethical to put people in certain positions, or any position, as an antinatalist would see it. But so obviously he's explained the context. You have a ship, it's going, so it's not coming back. The population on the ship has some capacity to sustain themselves, and so I have seen the film, but I actually can't remember if they just slowly sort of give up and that causes the systems to fail because people engage less, or if they could have actively continued keeping things up. But either way, over time, systems start to fail, people disengage, and eventually that all leads to everyone, dying and stuff. So it leads people to question, like, if you're in a situation of essentially like hopelessness and meaninglessness, is it okay to bring someone into that situation? Which is an interesting one, because, and this brings us on to the second observation, which I did not make. So I got this observation from the Voidcast episode, which I mentioned before. So in that episode, the two hosts talk about how many people might not pick up on it, but this story is really an allegory. I think it's the correct term is allegory for our current situation. So if you think about it, those people on the ship, they are a population that is contained within an object that is just drifting through space aimlessly. It's not particularly going in any direction. It's just aimlessly drifting through space. And we view that as, their lives are now meaningless. This is all going to come to an end. What is the point? Blah, blah, blah. It's depressing. But if you think about it, what situation are we in now? We're a population, a bigger population of like 8 billion, but we're a population, rather than we're on an object that is drifting through space. And eventually, all of it will come to an end. So we're basically in the same situation ourselves as these people. It's removed from ourselves, so we're observing it externally rather than observing ourselves, which makes it easier for people. And hey, Harbon's in the chat. But also everything's condensed. So in the situation we're currently in now, the numbers are bigger, the time frames are bigger, all of this sort of stuff. In that circumstance, it's external to us, so we can observe it as thinking it's something we're not in. Everything's on a shorter time frame with a smaller amount of people. And so it's easy for us to say, oh, that situation seems hopeless. Like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be in that situation. And like, would I bring a kid into that situation? It seems kind of cruel. Well, the thing is like, we are in that situation. It's just people have status quo bias, basically. The status quo is the situation we're in now. And so people become attached to that and essentially take it for granted. It's like the water you swim in. And so they don't necessarily recognize the same ethical sort of ethically relevant parts of the situation they're in than if they were observing it as an external third party, as you do in the film. I don't know if I explained that well, but you get what I mean. Yeah, so Heartborn's in the chat. Robert has just joined the chat as well from New York. Hey, Robert. And Nadia says there's no way the ship lasts 5.9 million years, or that they'd still be human in so long. Chimps were one with humans 5.9 million years ago. No. So in the film, when it jumps to, so the film kind of has chapters. So it's like day one, then it skips to like, a couple of weeks later or whatever. Then it skips to a couple of years later or months or whatever. It has like time relevant chapters, and the last chapter is like 5.9 million years in the future. Like everyone's dead, so there's no evolution happening. Like everyone has died. Yeah, and the ship is just drifting through space aimlessly, with no life on it. Cool. Let's continue.
Well into the closing credits. Even though I really liked it, I have to say this is one of the most disturbing movies I've seen. Amongst all the different themes it explores, I think it most saliently exposes just how much hope and purpose, whether real or not, are important in finding energy to continue daily life. At the same time, it points out how reality eventually prevails. I think one of the reasons why the movie is disturbing is because one could interpret the ship as representing Earth, a self-contained vessel with limited resources flying through space without a specific destination.
Sorry, there's just in the chat. So Nadia is in East Harlem, which that's in New York, right? Is it, or am I getting that wrong? I have been to New York, but it was a while ago, and I kind of forget. So you guys could organize a New York meetup. That would be cool to see. We do them in London. You guys could organize like a yeah, it's Manhattan. Cool. Yeah, you guys could organize like a New York meetup. I reckon you'd be able to get a decent amount of people there. You just have to plan it for like a month's time, or a couple of months time, and like advertise it. Advertise it in like the big Facebook groups. Cool. That's cool. There's two people in the chat from a the same place.
And with only as much hope as its occupants conjure up. This interpretation may be extrapolating a bit much, but it is thought-provoking. In the same vein, I also like the big picture of realizing we are all in the same boat. We depend on the same limited resources, and all will eventually face mortality. There is some comfort in the equalizing solidarity this could bring to encourage us to be more compassionate to ourselves and others. If only we realized it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, it is an interesting film, so I would recommend people watch it. And if you find the idea of the film interesting, watch it, and then also go watch the Voidcast episode as well. So episode 14 is Environmentalism and Antinatalism.
Question is, why would we want to protect the environment? For the moment, let's focus on humans and their predicament. Let's assume the sole...
Okay, sorry, the... Actually, I don't think that started from the start. The volume is unusually quiet on this one. So what I'm going to do is play it, and you guys can put your volume up, and I'm going to not talk as much or move the microphone away so my voice isn't as loud, so I don't deafen you.
With all the focus on climate change and environmental destruction lately, I've been thinking about viewing environmentalism through an antinatalist perspective. A simple dictionary definition for environmentalism is an ideology that aims to protect the environment. A natural, though often overlooked, follow-up question is, why would we want to protect the environment? For the moment, let's focus on humans and their predicament. Let's assume the sole purpose of protecting the environment is to spare humans of the perils of drastic climate-driven disruptions in their lives. If we assume that humans are the single largest source of destruction of natural habitats and contribution to unwanted climate change, and if having more humans means getting more destruction, then every environmentalist's goal should be to help ethically reduce the global population.
So that's what Vehement is all about. That's the voluntary human extinction movement. They're an environmentalist movement.
It's puzzling to me why something so obvious is so taboo. If your house is flooding because you left a faucet running over a faulty sink, the most logical first step to prevent worsening flooding is to shut off the valve. It's quite frustrating that this is so hard for people to hear. If people voluntarily opted to not procreate, we would spare billions of future people the suffering that will come with a harder way of life in a chaotic environment, and we would reduce the consequences existing people would have to deal with. I once voiced a version of this obvious fact in a public forum, and in addition to the idea being rejected, there were proposals suggesting that we can all just use fewer resources, implying that therefore the reproduction rate wouldn't have to be addressed. First, there is obviously a mathematical limit to this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he's going to say this, but I don't see that happening. So I think there are some instances where people will voluntarily use less resources, but the overall trend is that humanity is using more resources just because we've got so many more people coming out of poverty now in developing nations. So even if people like, for example, I might be misled, but the sort of common accepted wisdom is that Americans use the most. They're the most resource intensive population per capita. I might be wrong on that. There might be some European countries that per capita use more resources. But if we just take Westerners as an example, right? Like Westerners could voluntarily reduce the amount of resources that they use, which generally I don't think is going to happen. They might slightly, but significantly, I'm not hopeful. But the thing is that the Western lifestyle has been set as a standard. So many, if not all, developing nations are trying to achieve that. So the resource consumption is only going to go up. The only way I can see resource consumption going down significantly, and I may be wrong on this, but there are two ways. Either massive authoritarianism from governments, which is not a good thing, or we become more efficient. So we can achieve the same standard of living and and do all the things and consume all the things we want, but it just requires less input because the technology or whatever has become more efficient, or we produce less waste. There's less coming, because if you take food, for example, like an insane percentage, I think it's something like 30-40% of food that is produced is wasted. Now I might have got that statistic a bit wrong, but there's a significant amount is wasted. So we can tighten that up, stuff like that. But yeah, overall the trend is that we're using more resources. And Nadia is saying that Meetup, which I think you're talking about the app, right, doesn't list any antinatalism groups in NYC. I see some child-free groups, mostly for women. Yeah, so Nadia, one thing that I'm hoping to do is try and put something together that's going to help people organize meetups. I don't exactly know what that's going to look like yet, but I've got some ideas that I'm playing around with. So hopefully soon there will be something that is put together where then people who want to organize a meetup can just use that as a blueprint to create some sort of meetup event that they can then advertise. But yeah, if there's any movement on that part, if there's any movement on that, I will update people via a video. So Nadia is saying Qatar, Luxembourg, and the UAE are ahead of the US in resource usage. Yeah, okay, yeah. So there are a few countries that are using more. And Almari, hey, Almari's in the chat as well, saying, what about Jevons paradox, getting more efficient fixes nothing? I am not sure what Jevons paradox is, so if you could explain that in the chat, but I'm guessing maybe what you mean is that Jevons paradox is that if we become more efficient at producing things, it means that rather than maintaining the standard of living and using less resources, we actually increase the standard of living, so we end up using the same amount of resources as we do in the we did before. Is that what Jevons paradox is?
Second, we have to acknowledge that this leads to drastic reductions in quality, or at least style of life, whether we like it or not. It is physically unsustainable for more than 7 billion people to live like the industrialized middle and upper classes live currently. If we are to keep some sense of ethical avoidance of disparity, this leads to the need either to lower everyone's standards or reduce the population size by avoiding further procreation. I'm not against changing our standards. That will unavoidably happen for the vast majority of people regardless. But something has to give. And reducing the population size obviously makes more sense, although population reduction and limiting wastefulness of resources are certainly not mutually exclusive. Having said all this, as an antinatalist, it is clear to me that even if climate change were not a problem, avoiding procreation is the most ethical choice in order to reduce suffering. In fact, I would like to avoid antinatalism being limited to an environmental argument. Antinatalism makes sense because of the inherent characteristics of sentient existence and suffering, regardless of how the climate may or may not change. But if one is to claim environmentalist ideals, one should strongly consider leaning toward antinatalism if the goal of environmentalism is to reduce suffering, of humans or of other sentient creatures. And speaking of other sentient creatures, claiming environmentalism while ignoring the suffering of animals effectively makes environmentalism meaningless. It romanticizes evolution by natural selection. That is, it romanticizes a process that depends on death and destruction in order to perpetuate death and destruction further. Nature can be awe-inspiring and subjectively beautiful, for sure, but that is only part of the picture. The gazelle still experiences pain when it is eaten alive, and the cheetah still suffers as it starves when there's drought. We can protect those animals' natural habitat all we want, but their suffering still exists. I don't claim to have any easy answers to this problem, but to hold nature up as the ideal to aspire to is delusional if one cares about the suffering of sentient creatures. Someone listening to this might interpret...
Amara's just put in the chat, so Jevons paradox occurs when technological progress or government policy increases efficiency with resource use, reducing the amount of resources necessary for anyone to use, but the falling cost of use induces increase in demand enough that resource use is increased rather than reduced. Right. Okay. So the paradox kind of hinges on the change in prices, but yeah, I think I got somewhat close to it. But yeah, no. To be fair. Yeah, that also could happen. So maybe we're just generally fucked.
That I would want the extinction of all sentient beings. But that is not quite right. Although carrying out antinatalism would likely result in extinction, strictly speaking, that is not the goal. The goal is to end suffering, especially if the suffering is inflicted without consent. If somehow there were a way for beings to live without suffering, and it was their wish to keep living forever, that would be just fine from an antinatist perspective. But of course, such a feat is likely impossible in our physical universe, so this means extinction is the next logical conclusion. In the end, whether someone finds reasons in environmentalism or religion or philosophy or whatever else to not procreate, the reasons may not matter as much as long as the result is the ethical reduction of suffering. Thanks for listening.
Cool. Okay. Gonna bring my microphone back now. Yeah, there's a big there's one sort of big
Popular.
There's one oh, this one's actually got a video rather than a still image. Yeah, one sort of point of contact between what do you call it, environmentalism and antinatalism, which is the most common one that I hear people talk about, is with antinatalism, obviously, the view is that coming into existence, a sentient being coming into existence is a harm for that being. And in the wild, a lot of individuals are coming into existence. And so there's a question as to whether antinatalists should be environmentalists or not, because so to give one example of where, like, that sort of, where the ethical contact really hits home is rewilding. So if you take, like, so humans have deforested a lot of areas, which people can have qualms with that in and of itself, but given the fact, like, it's been done now, so now you have a question of, should we rewild, which, assuming that rewilding increases the amount of sentient beings that are going to be brought into existence on that land, many antinatalists would say, actually, no, we shouldn't. Whereas many environmentalists would say, yes, we definitely should. So that is one specific sort of conflict there. Heartborn is saying that he read or heard a lot of vegans advocating for continuing procreation. They say we must solve the wildlife suffering problem since we can't solve it in one generation, and we must continue to procreate. It's an interesting one. So it's, well, rather than delve into the topic in full, the only thing I would say is, like, out of all the arguments I've heard for procreation, that sort of argument is the one that comes close to being a good argument, although I'm not, like, convinced by it. But if you want to watch more on that, watch my video, The Antinatalist Dilemma. I did a video specifically on that topic. I think there's a delay on the stream. So Heartborn's just said that he really wants to see a separate video on that. Yeah, if you watch my video, The Antinatalist Dilemma, it goes into that.
I wish antinatalism were not needed. I wish suffering, the primary disease of sentience, did not need to be prevented. But it does. I am an antinatalist because it pains me to see suffering, especially when that suffering is preventable. It pains me to know that innocent people get thrown into an existence where, given sentience, suffering and death are 100% guaranteed. It pains me to know that if those responsible for procreation had been more thoughtful and kind and caring, they would have prevented needless and...
The horse is in the chat as well. But I'm not sure if they're making a joke or if they're a troll.
unconsented suffering. I think antinatalism is the most noble ideology, not because it is the most pretty or popular or intellectual, but because it is the most necessary in a non-ideal world. We are brought into a truly broken world, and we can delude ourselves all we want to ignore that fact, but it still remains a fact. a fact deeply ingrained into the very physical laws of our universe. Order will always be followed by disorder. And in that lies the inevitable fact that any sentience will witness change and loss. Nothing is permanent, and therefore no joy is permanent. It's true that by the same token, no suffering is permanent, but no suffering is necessary in the first place either. If only sentience were considerate enough to not perpetuate itself into other new beings. Over the course of my career, I've met and gotten to know the stories of thousands of people. But one thing is common across the board. The reason people see doctors is to address their suffering, either because they have an active illness or because...
Yeah, being a doctor as an antinatalist must be fucking hard, because it's like, as an antinatalist, you're constantly talking about the suffering that, like, certain people are imposing on other people. And, like, when you're a doctor, you're constantly coming into contact with the suffering that you are arguing about. So it must be pretty big. Pretty hard.
Because they want to avoid an illness, or at least minimize the suffering that comes with illness and aging. Some might say this makes me biased because my daily focus is more towards suffering. I would say that...
Yeah, I mean, some people call it a bias. Like, you can also just say that you're more informed. You know?
This is an intricate part of our reality.
Also, just calling someone biased is like, it's an ad hominem, so it's not actually an argument. Like, it can be a valid topic of conversation, but if you're actually arguing about well, if you're having a discussion about the arguments, then it's not really relevant.
I don't ignore the joys of life. Of course, I want to enjoy the good times. But this is because I am already existing. I don't have the choice to revert back to non-existence. It is too late for me. My fate, like everyone listening to this, is sealed. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Why am I an antinatalist? Because I don't want my children to suffer. And avoiding procreation is the only way to guarantee that. Someone who chooses to procreate, whether they see it or not, is dooming his or her children to suffer and die. I simply don't have the stomach to commit such a moral crime. It's not anyone's fault that these are the choices we face. Humans should be pitied for being in this predicament. As a pragmatist, though, making the best of a bad situation also reduces suffering. In addition to not procreating, the next best thing to do is to work toward reducing the suffering of those already here. We should all strive for that, whether in small or big ways, in our own lives and in the lives of others.
The germ theory is in the chat as well. Saying number 2, The Contagion Myth by Thomas S. Cohen and Sally Fallon Morell. Germ theory. What? First of all, what's number 1, and second of all, what is that? Is that a book recommendation you're making, or?
Wherein lies meaning. Thank you so much for listening and giving these ideas your valuable time and attention.
Cool. So that was actually a what do you call it? A submission to Amanda's contest. Cool. So it's 15. This one doesn't have a number, and then it's 17. So I'm assuming this is actually the next one. So this one will be interesting. Is this one? This one's an actual presentation by the looks of it. So, Antinatalism for the Practicing Clinician, a grand round style presentation. Okay, interesting. So there's a few more things in the chat. So Heartborn is saying being in healthcare is indeed hellish. I've heard quite a few testimonials from new acquaintances and friends. They have to hide it, living a big lie without being able to point to the actual cause. Oh, so Harkyor, you know antinatalists who work in healthcare as well. And Germ Theory is putting some more books, I presume they are, in the chat. Germ Theory. What are you putting in the chat for? Is it a are they like recommendations, or what are they relevant for?
Welcome. The following is a presentation intended for people who work in the medical field, but much of what I will discuss applies to the general public. Grand Rounds is a common type of presentation in medicine that dives into a clinically relevant topic, presents cases, and provides practical information clinicians can use in their practice. I chose to put this presentation together because antinatalism is a topic few clinicians are familiar with, even though it has the potential to do a lot of good in medicine. I have no financial conflicts of interest related to this topic or presentation. It goes without saying, though, that I am an antinatalist, and this means my take on the subject of this talk is biased. Of course, it would be hard to find anyone who is completely agnostic and unbiased on this issue, since most people are pro-natalists and thus would be biased in the opposite direction. Take a moment to think about it. Think back to all the patients you have witnessed suffering. All the times you have helped them alleviate this suffering, sometimes successfully, sometimes in vain.
Actually, before we go on, I'm just going to shrink myself so that you can, now that there's an actual presentation, I'm just going to shrink myself so that you guys can see the presentation, because usually it's a still image, so there's not really much to see. So there you go.
As a medical student, I witnessed a cyanotic newborn die before her mom had a chance to hold him. As a resident, I held the hand of a dying woman in the ICU with an inhumane number of tubes and lines coming out of her body. As an attending, numerous patients have shared with me how miserable getting old and disabled is. For most of my career, I didn't have the mental framework to realize that these and every scenario of disease and suffering could have been prevented. The way to do this is incredibly simple. Yet, sadly, few people actually take it seriously. I would like you to walk away from this talk not only with a lot of food for thought, but also with some tools to do something concrete with this new information. I'll go over the term antinatalism, show how it is medically relevant, most critically in the prevention of suffering, and how to implement these principles in clinical practice, and ideally everyday life in an ethical manner. Let's start with the term antinatalism. Although the concept has been around for millennia, there's no...
And Juan is in the chat from Milwaukee. Nice to see you in the chat, Juan.
No universally agreed upon definition, largely because the term didn't get coined until relatively recently. I would define it as a philosophy claiming it is unethical to bring sentient life into existence due to the inherent suffering and eventual death imposed on that being, especially considering such an imposition.
This is an interesting one, Heartborn. If you do know antinatalists who work in healthcare, then you could send them this presentation.
Occurs without the being's consent. It is important to know this definition presupposes two very important things. One, that suffering and death are harms worth preventing. Thus, imposing them is unethical. Two, that imposing a harm on someone without their consent is undesirable. Obviously, A being cannot give consent before coming into existence. Therefore, this harm is always imposed without consent. In contrast, pronatalism, or more commonly natalism, claims it is ethical and desirable to bring sentient life into existence. As you might imagine, this philosophy has massive implications. So I want to spend some time here recognizing that antinatalism can be very hard to internalize. It challenges societal norms, cultural beliefs, and perhaps even what one considers the meaning of life. There are some hard truths we need to contend with. First, sentient life itself has inherent harms. Second, once brought into existence, a sentient person will suffer and eventually die. Third, ethically, those responsible for that person's conception are responsible for his or her suffering. Now, by this, I mean they are undeniably responsible for the person being put in harm's way in the first place, not necessarily that they imposed all specific harms themselves. We could spend hours dissecting all these points and unfolding their implications, but my point here is to lay out the basic premises to highlight that.
You know, a lot of I've heard some people say two things simultaneously, which seem to suggest cognitive dissonance. So I've heard some people say, on the one hand, they don't agree that someone is responsible for the suffering of the person they create. You know, like he's saying here, you know, ethically, those responsible for that person's conception are responsible for his or her suffering. So I've heard people disagree with that, right? Because I agree with that, but I've heard people disagree with that. But then they also say, when it comes to politics, if you voted for X party, you are responsible for the suffering they have caused, right? So typically it tends to be left-wing people who say that about conservatives, but I'm sure it's happened the other way around as well. So that to me seems like a bit of cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, you're saying you took this action voting for a party, right? And whilst you didn't inflict the specific individual sufferings of that the party cause once they're in power, you voted for that party, and, you know, for the purposes of the argument, you got them into power, right? So you put that initial set of conditions in place, and that resulted to specific harms happening. So they blame people for that, but then when someone brings up this, they say, oh, I can't be held to account for all of the individual sufferings that this person is going through. I didn't know that those specific sufferings were going to happen when I created them. And it's like, well, no, you may not be the direct perpetrator of all of those specific sufferings and harms, but you did put in place the initial set of conditions that caused them all to happen, like when someone votes for a political party. And actually, when someone votes for a political party, it's less clear. You vote for a political party, you know, they may not, you may be voting for them because of their manifesto. You know, they may go off their manifesto. They may do things that, you know, you weren't expecting, all of this sort of stuff. But when you create someone, you've directly, and also when you vote for a party, you're only one vote in millions and millions of votes. But when it comes to procreation, you're that person who created. Okay, well, there's two of you, so you get half the responsibility each. And like, you can have a pretty good idea of all of the different harms that are gonna face them in life, or could potentially face them in life. So I kind of see these as analogous. There may be some specific differences between voting for a political party and creating someone, but like, I've heard the same person say these two things, like disagree with that, but agree with the other one. And I just always thought, like, do you not see like how you're contradicting yourself there? I don't know what you guys think, if that is like a decent analogy, but yeah. So Heartborn says, I believe we are responsible for the suffering we might cause to all future generations that spawn from us. Yeah, exactly. I agree with that. Juan says, I wish most people would admit it after doing some rational thinking, but they choose illusions over facts. Yeah. And Hartborn says, let's say somewhat responsible, which still is a type of responsibility. Yeah, so you can say somewhat responsible. I think when it comes to voting for a political party, I would use a term like somewhat responsible. But when it comes to creating someone, like, I don't feel like I can really water it down, because it's like when you had complete control. So like when it comes to voting for a political party, yeah, you may have voted for them, but like all of that stuff may have happened anyway. Like even if you abstained from voting, they could have got past the mark that they needed to be able to get into power. But so it may have been out of your hands anyway. Like, so you're like somewhat responsible, if you actively participated in it. But with procreation, it's like, it ain't happening unless you take an active part in it. So it's like the chain of events, if you take any specific suffering, like the chain of events all come back to you. You're the fundamental cause of them. So I would find it hard to water it down to somewhat responsible. I do think with voting that's accurate, but when it comes to this, like, I'm more inclined to use a stronger form. Cool. Okay, I was just seeing if there's anything else in the chat.
If we admit these things are true, we have some work to do as medical professionals who care about people. Despite antinatalism being logically consistent, medical professionals are just as susceptible as anyone else to reject the philosophy based on previously held beliefs.
But it's interesting. So with healthcare, there are quite unique interactions with antinatalism and healthcare, because in healthcare, it may depend on the country and the system, but they put like a lot of emphasis on consent, right? It's hard for me to give specific examples because I'm actually not a healthcare professional, obviously, but like I presume in medical ethics, there's a specific interpretation of what consent means and where it's applicable and where it's not. And so medical professionals could actually have a specific interpretation of the consent argument that the layperson wouldn't have. But yeah.
But if we really mean it when we say we want to reduce suffering in an ethical way, we can't ignore antinatalism being a way to do this. Preventing or minimizing harm is one of the top priorities in medicine. Whenever we give a medical recommendation or administer a treatment, reducing harm as much as possible should be one of our most important guiding principles. Our job as medical professionals is to help reduce and prevent suffering. Much of our energy is spent in attempting to delay death, presumably in most cases for those who want that death delayed. Although the actual indefinite prevention of death is not seen as realistic for currently living people, death can indeed be prevented simply by preventing conception in the first place. I will discuss consent and patient autonomy in more depth later, but few would argue against the importance of patients being able to understand and give permission to any intervention that affects their bodies. Consent is central to ethical antinatalism. So, medicine and antinatalism have very similar goals. Most of us went into the medical field to help reduce suffering. If we as medical professionals...
Oh, sorry, I wasn't, didn't pause. Yeah, that's interesting that he's highlighting the common roots of the two things. So maybe his goal is here, and maybe I'm like late here, maybe everyone else has realized this, but like maybe he's just trying to show that antinatalism is a logical conclusion from the starting point that medical ethics takes. And so he's trying to show that if we are to take medical ethics seriously, antinatalism should be a norm in the medical workplace, or the medical setting. Yeah, interesting.
Are serious about reducing suffering, we should also be serious about ethically preventing it altogether. As you have already figured out, the prevention I'm talking about does not apply to current people.
And hey, Yana's in the chat. And Yana says, I'm not sure if medicine ultimately aims to reduce suffering or keep alive at all costs, like keep people living at all costs. So a lot of, so there will be different classifications. So some medicine will be at preventing harm. Some medicine will be alleviating harm. And both of those two things can be done while someone is alive and maintaining their life, but also when it comes to euthanasia, that can be done for purposes of preventing and alleviating harm being done to someone. So I wouldn't say that medicine ultimately aims to keep people alive, because there are circumstances, it depends on the country obviously and the system, but there are circumstances where euthanasia is an option for people. So I wouldn't say ultimately medicine aims to keep people alive. It depends. If you mean medicine as in like actual physical medicine, or you just mean the institution of medicine in general, it depends what you mean. And Exploring Antinatalism podcast is in the chat. Hey, Amanda. Antinatalism takes essentially the same pledge that doctors do, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Heartborn says something of an informal oath. What does AFAIK mean? Am I getting this wrong? Is that like similar to AFK, away from keyboard? I'm not sure what you mean. As far as I know, right? Okay, yeah, I'm just being an idiot.
In the sense that we'll be able to prevent death and suffering for them.
And Hobo's saying medicine was also used not too long ago for heinous purposes. Very true. Even things that are established and invented to help people can be used for bad purposes, and the other way around. There can be things that are made to hurt people that can, in some cases, be used to benefit people as well. But it's a valid point, Hobo.
Rather, this prevention applies to potential future people. I would argue contraception is one of the most
Ro is in the chat as well.
Valuable human inventions. Avoiding conception is the only guaranteed way to prevent suffering and death. As clinicians, we should use this tool to its full ethical extent. I won't go into the specifics of counseling patients through all the possible contraception methods, but I wanted to point out the variety of options we have.
It won't just be you guys. I actually can't read this either. But it is. Let me just have a look. So it is various methods of birth control. And I think it's just talking about the pros and cons of different types, I think.
At the top of this table are the most effective methods, not including abstinence. The risk of pregnancy noted here in the first column refers to the number of women out of every 100 who have an unintended pregnancy within the first year of typical use of each method. The term typical use is distinguished from perfect use and refers to the failure rate in the hands of an average user that may not always follow the instructions of use perfectly. Therefore, this quoted rate of failure is higher than that for perfect use, which assumes perfect adherence to instructions, but still has risk of failure due to the margin of error inherent in the mechanism of the contraceptive method. The table here lists methods approved by the FDA in the US as of this recording. There are a few other male contraception options in development, but those are not yet widely available.
Yeah, there's two that I know of. There's one which is the male pill, which is being developed, and the other one is called vasogel, which is basically like a temporary vasectomy. So obviously, with a vasectomy, there's the vas deferens tubes, which they cut and remove a section. But the vasogel would be injected into the tube and basically form it would be like a block, a barrier, like a wall, so that the sperm can't get out. So you, for all intents and purposes, at that point have a vasectomy, but it's easily reversible, so they can go back in and inject something that causes it to dissolve. So it's like a temporary vasectomy.
Speaking of which, as you may
But as far as I'm aware, neither of those things are actually on the market yet. They're both still in development and testing.
notice, most of the methods listed here are for women. But this, of course, is not a reflection of whose decision matters more. Sorry to state the obvious, but a lot of people seem to forget basic biology. I find it frustrating when contraception counseling focuses on women as if they were the only ones responsible. Even some electronic medical record systems are set up such that it is assumed that contraception is only a women's health issue. Contraception counseling should be part of every patient's regular care if they are biologically capable of reproducing. Normalizing this is step one. Without patient autonomy, we lose all sense of ethics in medicine. And as with any medical intervention, consent is key. Our job in the clinical setting is not to proselytize, but rather to inform and present options that make both medical and ethical sense based on our expertise.
So Ro in the chat is saying it's mainly a women's health issue, though. Women have a lot more to lose. So that is true. When it comes to the risks and the the burden and stuff like that of like the potential risks of sex and stuff are and potential consequences are more for women. They're higher for women, but that doesn't mean that like men should not take any responsibility. Obviously, men and women are both equally responsible for ensuring conception doesn't occur. But it is the case that if conception does occur, then obviously like the vast majority of the burden then or the outcome then falls on the woman. But yeah.
And knowledge. We should stay as far away as possible from coercion. Let's remember that contraception counseling is standard of care. We are not talking about earth-shaking or unorthodox practices here. We are simply making sure we don't forget to do one of the most important parts of our job. Because there are so many pregnancies that happen due to poor or no contraception.
It's actually astounding that 50% of all pregnancies are unintended. That was a statistic released by the, I believe it was the UN recently. I think in the past year, or maybe I just saw it in the past year, but it's just astounding that like, I think most people, even if they're not antinatalists, will recognize that pretty much the most significant thing you can do in your own life is create someone, and the most significant thing you can do to someone else is obviously create them. And yet people are so like blasé about this fact that 50% of pregnancies are unintended. It's just astounding to me.
Adherence.
I mean, Heartborn is surprised that it's only half. Like, well, to be honest, my faith in humanity is so low that I also probably wouldn't, I'm also somewhat surprised it's half, but the fact that it is half is astounding.
And are unintended. Part of the counseling of patients involves pointing out to those who don't plan to conceive in the immediate future that this is their desire. If a patient is sexually active with the opposite sex and does not intend to conceive within a year, we should make sure they have a reliable form of contraception. I'll go into various examples to illustrate this in a minute. Just like we have recommendations for people to stop smoking, we should have recommendations for people who don't plan to reproduce. Ideally, we should make a strong recommendation based on the patient's values and give them the tools to carry out this recommendation. We'll start with a simple example. We have a 25-year-old male with no significant past medical history who presents for a physical and has no specific concerns. As part of a physical, you can use a checklist of general health screenings to go through and not miss. On the left is an example of a generic list for women, and on the right for men. These are based on the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force guidelines. Many EHRs allow you to keep record of a list such as this easily accessible and customizable. So this is one way you can include contraception within your own list of items to discuss. The beauty of a list like this is that if you don't get to something on your first visit, you can always have a reminder to come back to it at the next appointment.
Oh, what the hell? That's so weird. Safari just quit randomly. Oh, sorry.
Male with no...
That is so odd. Okay, we're back. Let me just quickly stop sharing my screen to just check things are actually back. Yeah, that's so bizarre. What the fuck? The app literally just shut itself down. The stream is still going. Everything is fine. Can someone just put in the chat saying that it's everything is cool? People can still see, or can people not? Can people not see? Okay, cheers, Ro. Thanks, Amanda, as well, and Juan. Well, that was fucking weird. Anyway, let's continue.
Significant past medical history who presents for a physical and has no specific concern.
Hang on, we've seen that bit. We got to this bit.
If you don't get to something on your first visit, you can always have a
And hey, Dio as well. Dio's in the chat.
reminder to come back to it at the next appointment. Everyone has their own style and flow, so the timing of when you introduce this topic is up to you and your patient's health priorities. You can start by normalizing this topic and saying, as part of your physical, I'd like to address some routine questions. Have you been sexually active within the past year? Are you sexually active with men, women, or both? At this point, the line of questions depends on the relevance of the biological possibility of conception. So you can ask, do you use any form of contraception? Of course, reduction of STIs may still be pertinent, so condom use could still be addressed. If the patient is using reliable contraception, you may decide to move on to other topics. However, it may still be worth pursuing the next set of questions for future options. You may ask, do you plan to have children within a year? And do you plan to have children at some point in the future? I'm surprised by the number of people in my practice that say no to this second question and yet do not use a reliable form of contraception.
That's so mad.
These people may be those who have never had children or who did have children but don't plan to have any more and are still biologically capable of having them. I would say this is the population that we can do the most for in preventing unplanned conceptions. As you may have already encountered in your practice, there are those people who have not really given any serious thought to these questions. This is yet another group of people we can greatly help. Lastly, it is important to point out that if the patient expresses desire to have children and there are no standard medical contraindications to this, respect for autonomy dictates further discussion of contraception be tailored to that patient's values, such as timing of planned conception and the like. Although by no means obligatory, if the patient does not plan to have children in the future, permanent contraception options, such as vasectomy, should at least be considered. For the next case example, we have a 35-year-old woman with type 2 diabetes, hyperlipidemia, and tobacco use. She is here for regular follow-up, but hasn't yet had a physical. In this case, her medical conditions should be addressed first, and afterwards, if time allows, her general preventive healthcare measures should be addressed. This should include contraception, if biologically relevant. I won't go into the nuances of choosing contraception options in the setting of certain medical conditions. However, I'd like to use this next example to illustrate something that mainstream medicine tends to ignore, and that is informed consent when it comes to the risk of pregnancy. This 28-year-old woman with obesity and hypertension is interested in discussing contraception options and plans to conceive at some point in the future. Just as we should inform patients of the risks of the contraception methods available, it is equally important to inform them of the risks that come with pregnancy. Even though there are obvious risks to the future child, like death and suffering, as I pointed in the beginning.
I wonder, I don't know if he's implicitly implying there. I mean, maybe it's not intentional. Maybe I'm just like taking it from it when I shouldn't have. But do you think he's implying there that like it isn't normal for healthcare professionals to inform people of the risks of pregnancy? Because that's pretty mad.
In practice, this conversation would focus on the risk to the mother, since this is the patient in front of you at the moment. I generally divide the risks of pregnancy into the common, less common, but not rare, and the uncommon. This allows people to have a better idea of what can happen realistically and make a more informed decision. Of course, this list is by no means comprehensive, given that pregnancy has dozens and dozens of potential risks. Because people may not be expecting you to bring these risks up, it's useful to normalize the discussion with something like, since pregnancy is a major change in the body that comes with inherent risks, I usually go over these risks, especially when it's a first pregnancy. This helps you be better informed before getting pregnant and gives you space to ask any questions you may have. Again, the goal here is not to coerce, but rather to present the reality of the situation so that people will give proper consideration to this paramount decision and be better informed. If you want to be complete, I suppose you could also discuss the benefits of pregnancy, though medically speaking, there are far fewer benefits than risks. From a practical perspective, you would likely highlight the most common risks and those risks your patient would find important, according to her values. In the case of this example patient with a history of hypertension and obesity, you may want to highlight preeclampsia and other complications that are more likely to be seen in the setting of her comorbidities. Even though contraception counseling is mostly thought of as an outpatient interaction, there are a lot of inpatient opportunities to bring this topic up. We just have to be mindful enough to bring it up, especially if it is at a point when the patient is more likely to pay attention.
Maybe I'm showing my ignorance. So preeclampsia was mentioned on the previous slide, and Nadia is mentioning it's a big deal. What is that? Maybe I don't know it by its like official name, but yeah, what is that?
Here are a few examples. If the current emission problem puts the patient at a higher risk pregnancy category in the future, were she to get pregnant, this is worth pointing out. For example, if she was admitted with diabetic ketoacidosis or another diabetes complication, and she is of childbearing age, it is reasonable to ask about contraception with the intent of informing the patient of the higher risk of a complicated pregnancy were she to get pregnant. The use of a teratogenic drug, such as tobacco or excess alcohol, or having been prescribed a teratogenic medication, is also another opportunity to discuss contraception. This can apply to both men and women because exposure in the household may not be limited to one person. Although most STIs are treated in the outpatient world, when these present as part of someone's inpatient admission, this is yet another opportunity to talk about contraception. And of course, obstetric admissions and discussions of future contraception options are also important not to miss. One final point I would like to make. Having antinatalism in mind when practicing medicine is usually not glamorous. There will be no adrenaline rush. No one will call you a hero or praise your expert clinical skills. But you will have helped prevent a lifetime of suffering. You will have truly saved a life. You will have done the right thing.
Yeah, the only thing there, instead of saying saved a life, I would say spared a life, but nitpicky. Nadi's saying it's high blood pressure, but with a bunch of other things on the side. And Heartborn is saying a quote, with preeclampsia, you might have high blood pressure, high levels of protein in urine that indicate kidney damage and other signs of organ damage. Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. I mean, I would not put my body through that, but.
In summary, the principles of ethical antinatalism should be applied to clinical practice, given the tremendous positive impact they can have in the reduction of suffering. By far, the most valuable tool to do this is contraception, but this is most effective when coupled with compassionately delivered information that allows patients to make their own decisions by being aware of the risks these decisions entail. Think of all the suffering we could prevent if all of us, as medical practitioners, discussed contraception more routinely. We could actually save lives and spare incalculable suffering from those not yet conceived. Because we can do better than simply help stall death for those already here. We can prevent death and suffering altogether. I can't think of better preventive medical care than that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this presentation was useful. Feel free to leave any constructive feedback below or share your experiences or clinical tips related to this topic.
Interesting. Let's see again if anyone has I can't see anyone that's obviously a healthcare professional. Thomas Sekas is saying, given that conceptions do occur even when using contraception, what is your opinion on abortion? All right, it's asking about abortion. Antinatalist is saying, my husband is an MD but rejects AN. Right. Must be a tricky one to navigate in the relationship. So glad to see you made this video. You speak so I can't understand. No, they're not a healthcare professional either. Cool. Okay, so that was 16, wasn't it? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 to go. Oh, hang on a minute. Okay, no, sorry. 19 is the conversation, which is an hour and a half long. So we won't be doing that this live stream. So we've got 3 left to go. That will have to be a separate live stream.
One of the counter-arguments some people give against antinatalism
So this one is exploring suffering, having ultimate purpose.
is that suffering can or does have an ultimate purpose. To them, this justifies suffering and thus procreation, which leads to suffering. One of the problems with this argument is that that purpose is usually unknown to the individual. So if purpose to suffer justifies suffering, one has to ask, what value is it to the individual who experienced it without knowing of its purpose? Some might say that a benefit to the larger group is sufficient justification. On the surface, this seems reasonable from a big picture perspective, but there's a big problem with that. Suffering must be analyzed from the perspective of the individual, not some sort of collective or group. The reason for this is that all sentience is based within individuals. That's where the brains are. That's where the subjective experience lies, in the individual brain that processes information and interprets it. Multiple individuals can suffer in the same general physical area, of course, but at the end of the day, it's the individual beings who are doing the suffering. Talking about net suffering of a group is really meaningless in any practical manner except to say that more people suffering is bad because it is bad for more individuals. Given that, even if there is purpose to suffering, having people not know this purpose begs the question, so what? So what if there is a purpose to suffering if the individuals involved still suffer needlessly from their perspective? At best, this entails a kind of cruel, non-consensual sacrifice for others that inevitably is inequitable and implies...
Yeah, exactly. It depends what the reason is as well, right? Like, there are so many forms of suffering that will have a purpose, but the purpose is just like dog shit. So, for example, when people buy animal products, for food or clothing or whatever, it's like, yeah, it serves a purpose. Like, it's going to give that person nutrition or warmth in terms of clothing or fashion, but is that a good enough purpose to justify it ethically? No. So, but anyway, obviously he's not making the point that, like, something having purpose justifies the he made the same point.
Is one individual's value is less than another's. It implies some people's worth is less because they end up with more needless suffering than others from their perspective. And what good is it to say all individuals have the same worth if the actual outcome of some people's subjective suffering is to suffer needlessly? What good is that to them? How does that make them equally worthy in any pragmatic sense? Surely, if egalitarian morality is going to mean anything, we cannot weigh one innocent person's suffering as better over another's. To be clear, when I say suffering has a purpose in this line of thinking, I'm not referring to instrumental purpose for the being already in existence, such as the pain of physical exercise yielding better health in the future. Rather, I'm referring to an ultimate purpose that would justify bringing that being into existence when he or she otherwise would not have existed. This kind of purpose inevitably involves the suffering of an innocent being because no newly created being is morally guilty of anything when they first come into existence, especially considering this existence is obviously caused without their consent. Of course, the argument I make here, questioning purpose as a justification for procreation, has certain implicit assumptions. It assumes the individual ceases to be sentient upon death. That is, there is no chance of him knowing of any future benefit to his suffering after he dies. It also assumes the individual is only sentient after being conceived, not before. These assumptions are admittedly ultimately unprovable, but they're also not unfounded. Given what we know about neurobiology, they're not unreasonable. These assumptions, then, could be questioned by some religions. A podcast I recently listened to brought up something interesting along these lines. As a metaphysical exercise, let's consider the question of whether antinatalism would still be valid if everyone went to heaven after death, for example. That is, everyone's suffering would eventually be seen as ending in eternal benefit. One could argue that, no, it still does not justify existence because innocent, non-consensual suffering still occurred, no matter what their reward later, and the ends don't justify the means because the means were so cruel. From a pragmatic standpoint, however, we currently cannot prove or have physical evidence for everyone being rewarded.
Yeah, I mean, in that circumstance, if people did go to heaven, like, for eternal bliss, to me, it wouldn't really change, well, it wouldn't change my opinion, because it's like, you're still imposing suffering on someone, and all of the, good things that you would have in heaven, like, non-existence has no desire for that. Like, the only reason there is a need or desire for that is because you created it when you created the person. So, to me, like, it doesn't really matter when it comes to procreation. It doesn't really matter how big the carrot is. Like, the thing that only seems to be relevant to me is the stick when it comes to thinking about whether you should create someone or not.
Do we actually know the answer? No. The best we can do,
and Ryu's in the chat,
is act based on the available evidence. And since the available evidence points to some reasonable chance of beings only being sentient while alive, the safest, least harmful route is not to bring them into existence. Is it possible everyone will go to heaven? Maybe. But this is not certain. So no matter what, we'll always be working with limited data and thus be gambling. And if we care about ethics and compassion, we have to do our best to minimize harm, especially when getting it wrong is so catastrophic. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, that one was interesting, like a little thought experiment. So this one is a short story about an empty. I'm not sure if there's like a hidden message in that name that I'm missing. But... Wait, I'm just gonna check. Okay. I'm just gonna just because it seems like there's no talking, and there's just music, just in case the music is gonna cause a copyright claim. I have muted the video so we can still read. Plus the music was quite quiet anyway, so. Hang on, I've just realized I need to shrink myself so that I don't block any of the text. There you go. Yeah, it was put quite well there. Like, why create a situation where you have the need to reduce suffering when you can simply not create the situation in the first place? So now it's getting into like the procreational Ponzi scheme. So it's coming back to what Antinatalist MD was talking about before, like the burden of antinatalism. Interesting short story. So I'm assuming that was like someone came to her in a dream. I'm assuming it was like the sort of ghost or soul of her parent, I think, by the sounds of it. So like I said before, we'll skip this one because that's conversation with a non-antinatalist and it's an hour and a half long. So that'll have to be a live stream on its own. Although even that's quite long for a live stream to watch an hour and a half video. So I'm not sure if I will get round to having a live stream about that one, but definitely go watch that one on your own. I'll include a link for that one in the description if I remember. Let me just make a note of that. So the links were, there was a link, the Voidcast episode, and also the Convo episode. Cool. So this is the last one for this stream, 9 minutes long. So let's see what, so it's the problem of suffering for the theist.
The problem of suffering, which is equivalent to the problem of evil in my mind, is one of the fundamental questions theists have to answer to defend their position. If God created the universe, then he created the set of conditions for sentient beings to exist. Since sentience cannot be separated from suffering in the universe as we know it, that means God is responsible for those beings suffering. If one thinks the suffering of innocent beings is bad, then that means God is responsible for this bad thing. So the age-old question is, if God is good, how does a good God justify creating suffering? There are various ways to answer this, and I'll give 5 here. Number 1, God is in fact good, but not flawless, as he made a mistake in creating suffering. Moreover, he is unable to fix this suffering, since a good God would want to fix it.
So obviously that explanation would not work for some religions, because some religions claim that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. So, that one wouldn't work for some of them.
And thus is also not all-powerful. Perhaps like an observer that regrets the horror he mistakenly created, he watches sadly as it unfolds. Number 2, God is not good. This could mean he is bad and purposely created suffering and is pleased with the outcome, or he is just neutral or amoral. In other words, just a blind creator without a particular inclination to care about the outcome one way or another. Number 3, God did not create the universe and is instead in it trying to deal with the consequences. Again, limited power would be a factor here. Number 4, God did exist and created the universe, mistakenly or not, but no longer exists. So assigning responsibility and reparations at this point in time is fruitless. Number 5, God never existed
and therefore he did not create the universe and is not morally responsible for the outcome. I should note, in this discussion, God is not necessarily any specific deity described by religion, but can be thought of as any creator or creators that is or was a conscious entity participant in the creation of the universe and or its workings at some point in time. This leaves a door open to both natural entities such as artificial intelligence and supernatural entities such as traditional gods. The assumption that God created the universe is impossible to prove or disprove. If the universe came into being on its own without a creator, then the points I just mentioned are moot, of course. The other assumption is that suffering is bad. One does not really have to think very hard to arrive at this conclusion, as we all suffer and we can all relate to how unpleasant this suffering is. But it is not trivial to say all suffering is bad. In fact, I don't claim that. Some suffering has instrumental value for already existing beings. What I do claim is that newly created and non-consensual suffering is always bad. Creating suffering by creating a new being that had no choice in the matter and that will suffer, and importantly, could not suffer before being created, is always bad. Part of the reason for this is that it is done without consent, but another reason is that there is the assumption that the decision to go ahead with creation was a conscious one, knowing that suffering would result. This entails knowing that the action will bring about non-consensual harm. We often call that a crime. But even if the action was carried out unknowingly, the result is still harmful. So although there might not have been malicious intent, there is still a bad outcome, and thus a negative result that should have been avoided. If we are being intellectually honest, when we are faced with the question of the existence of God, we have to ask ourselves these things. We have to take a side. Either we believe suffering of innocent beings is bad, or we don't. If it is bad, it's hard to justify a good, all-powerful God. If it is not bad, then we have to question the value of all ethical thought. After all, if it is not bad to make innocent beings suffer, then what is bad? Even if we looked at this completely selfishly and in a self-centered way, we would have to deny the fact that we ourselves would not want to suffer for something we are not guilty or responsible for. At a more mundane level, we would have to ignore how avoidance of suffering guides most of our actions. We eat to avoid hunger. We pursue money to buy things that will please us, or...
Yeah, people don't realize how, like, it... I don't know if I'm going to articulate this well, but it's almost like the baseline. I think I talked about this actually yesterday on the reaction stream. Like, it's like the baseline of life seems to be suffering. That's what things always revert back to without any active input. So one example is food, water. If you don't put any energy into or work into getting food and water, you will slip into suffering. You have to actively put energy into avoiding that and trying to achieve pleasure. And it seems like that's the case for basically anything. You always have to be actively putting in work to avoid suffering. And so it seems like the baseline that things always come back to is suffering and harm. And you have to actively put work in to keep your head above water, basically.
Or make life easier. We entertain ourselves to feel less displeasure, etc. Not all these decisions are rational, of course. The smoker enjoys the short-term...
And Vegan Avenger is in the chat as well. I like the Peter Watts God is a virus echopraxia theory. I don't know what echopraxia is, but I've not heard of that one. If I just type in Peter Watts, God is a virus theory, will it come up? I guess.
Pleasure of the cigarette at the expense of likely displeasure later on, but the drive.
Yeah, and Roe is saying it's like Buddhism. They say one of the noble truths is that life is full of suffering and dissatisfaction. Exactly, yeah, that's like, there's many parallels between antinatalism and Buddhism. But yeah, it seems like the natural state of things is suffering and dissatisfaction. You've got to actively put work to get away from that baseline.
To pleasure and reduction of suffering is still the motivation. There is the middle ground of thinking not all suffering is bad, again excluding consensual instrumental suffering. This often includes or involves the idea that the suffering will be compensated later on. The problem with this assertion is lack of evidence and the high risk of being wrong. If one is wrong about avoiding suffering by not procreating, no offspring is harmed. If one is wrong about suffering being rewarded later on, one has just created suffering unnecessarily. Since I don't know of anything that definitively demonstrates evidence for this reward consistently across the board, and it is vital that it applies across the board in order for ethics to prevail, then it's obvious that the less harmful route of non-procreation is better. Going back to Proposition 1, in justifying a good God, we could choose to believe that God is suffering in his regret over creation. This would be incredibly tragic and sad, and God would deserve our pity. We all know what it feels like to make a mistake we feel awful about. But imagine being responsible for all the suffering in the world, caring
talk about the motherload of all fuck-ups
about it, knowing it's your fault, and even worse, not being able to fix it. That sounds like terrible, terrible psychological torment. Ultimately, I don't know what the answer is for the theist's dilemma here, but this is the only option I can think of that a theist can choose and still be consistent in elevating ethical values. That is, believing in a God that is eternally plagued by having committed the worst mistake imaginable, about which he can do nothing substantial to remedy it. This approach tosses a lot of theology out the window, of course, but how else can a theist be consistent? Throwing up his hands and invoking the mysterious ways that God works in too conveniently removes the theist's need to think about his conclusions. And he should think about his conclusions because these ultimately affect his actions in the world. In closing, I should say the theist is just like everyone else, stuck in the world that he did not consent to come into. But despite being thrown into a situation we didn't consent to be in, however much we may not like it, we do have to make decisions. And since we should strive to avoid perpetuating the suffering that got us here, we should be responsible with our decisions and minimize the harm that comes from them. We can do better than those who are responsible for us being here. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, one thing and that was the last one, by the way. So I'll bring back on to just me. One of the things I found odd is that you'll get, so when a theist is presented with the problem of evil, sometimes they'll respond as in oh yeah, well it's it's a result of humans having free will, and unfortunately as a result of free will humans can do evil acts, right? And that always strikes, well, doesn't always, but since being antinatalist, that struck me with two things. First of all, you're admitting that the world is full of suffering and evil, so why would you bring someone into that? But also, you're saying that it's full of suffering and evil because of the intentional acts people make. why would you play into that and be one of those people making an intentional act that is going to bring more suffering into the world, i.e. procreation? So like from an antinatalist perspective, I think an antinatalist perspective adds just more depth to the pushback against theism of the problem of evil, or certain types of theism. But anyway, yeah, that, and also, yeah, Yana's in the chat. I agree, free will doesn't exist, but it's a very powerful illusion. Anyway, yeah, so that was the rest of Antinatalist MD's episodes, apart from 19. 19 is an hour and a half, so it's quite long. I don't know if I will get around to doing a live stream of that one. So I would say I will put the link for that in the description so you can find it yourself directly. Go check episode 19 out on your own. But yeah, thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming. And for everyone who's been in the chat as well. It's always nice to have people in the chat, and I hope it's been nice for some people that it's at a different time than I usually do in the morning here. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I think, have I got anything else? So I've got a video coming out on Wednesday, which, as I said yesterday, I confirmed after I did that poll that it's antinatalism in Israel. So that's quite good. Well, no. I mean, that episode is very good, but like I'm just saying, it's quite good that it's coming out soon, because I've been away, so I've been less productive recently. But yeah, antinatalism in Israel was a super interesting episode. Two really interesting people who have both done big antinatalist things in Israel. So definitely definitely watch that when it comes out on Wednesday to hear about those two people, because they're both really interesting and they've got some good plans for the future as well. And the other thing is, I think the next video I'll be working on will be going back to an old series that I haven't added to for ages, which I started ages ago, which was, is this person antinatalist? And I did an episode on Yuval Noah Harari and Ricky Gervais. And the next episode is going to be on Doug Stanhope. And I think probably everyone in the chat already knows the answer to the question, but I think it's still going to be an interesting episode because we're going to be exploring all the different things he said and stuff. So yeah, that is the next couple of videos that are going to be coming out. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for engaging in the chat. And it's been really interesting to hear all your thoughts. And I will, very quickly at the last minute, Mr. Paul is in the chat, new person in the chat. Nice to see you, Mr. Paul. I'm not sure I've seen you in the chat before, but maybe I'm misremembering because there's been quite a few lives now. But anyway, thanks everyone for coming, and I will see you all in the next one.